York, this is Democracy Now!
I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announces the House of Representatives will launch a formal impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump over allegations from a whistleblower that Trump sought help from the Ukrainian president to investigate his presidential rival, Joe Biden, and his son. We'll get response from Democratic Congressmember Al Green, who was the first to call for Trump's impeachment. Then President Trump addresses the United Nations General Assembly.
All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened.
We'll get response from political analyst Vijay Prashad. His latest article, World Leaders Gather at the UN in the Face of War, Climate Catastrophe, and Global Worker Exploitation. Then to the United Kingdom, where Parliament has reconvened following the High Court's stunning ruling that Prime Minister Boris Johnson unlawfully suspended Parliament in order to push through Brexit.
The Court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
Calls are growing for the Prime Minister's resignation. We'll speak with the legendary British singer-songwriter and activist Billy Bragg. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The House of Representatives is launching a formal impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump, who becomes just the 4th U.S. president to face impeachment. On Tuesday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi accused Trump of betraying his oath of office, the country's national security, and the integrity of the country's election system.
I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. I'm directing our 6 committees to proceed with their investigations under that umbrella of impeachment inquiry. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law.
For months, Speaker Pelosi had resisted calls by progressive Democrats to back impeachment, but that changed after President Trump publicly admitted he urged the president of Ukraine to open a probe into the dealings of his potential 2020 presidential rival, Joe Biden, and his son Hunter, who served on the board of one of Ukraine's largest natural gas companies. Trump has also admitted to withholding $391 million in aid to Ukraine. On Tuesday, President Trump dismissed the impeachment inquiry.
Look, it's just a continuation of the witch hunt. It's the worst witch hunt in political history.
Scandal came to light after a whistleblower in the intelligence community wrote an internal complaint about Trump's actions. On Tuesday, the Republican-controlled Senate unanimously passed a non-binding resolution calling on the Trump administration to release the whistleblower's complaint. Meanwhile, the actions of Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, in Ukraine are facing new scrutiny. The Washington Post reports he pursued a shadow agenda on Ukraine, pushing aside key foreign policy officials. He said he was doing this at the behest of the State Department. We'll have more on the impeachment inquiry after headlines. The United Nations-backed Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is warning the world must quickly cut greenhouse gas emissions or face catastrophic sea level rise that could threaten hundreds of millions of people. Earlier today, the IPCC released a landmark study on how the climate crisis is impacting the world's oceans, from rising sea levels to collapsing marine life. Co Barrett is the vice chair of the IPCC and head of research at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA.
The consequences for nature and humanity are sweeping and severe. This report highlights also the urgency of timely, ambitious, coordinated, and enduring action. What is at stake is the health of ecosystems, wildlife, and importantly, the world we leave for our children.
In news from the United Nations General Assembly, the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is facing widespread condemnation after using his UN address to defend the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest, attack indigenous leaders, and accuse the international community of lying about the recent devastating fires in the Amazon.
It is a fallacy to say that the Amazon is the heritage of humankind, and a misconception as confirmed by scientists to say that our Amazonian forests are the lungs of the world. The Amazon is not being devastated, nor is it being consumed by fire, as the media misleadingly says.
Amazon Watch decried the far-right President Bolsonaro's address, stating, quote, "Today the Amazon continues to burn and may soon reach an unrecoverable tipping point due to Bolsonaro's complicity with environmental crime." The president of Brazil also used his address at the United Nations to personally attack the Brazilian indigenous leader, Chief Raoni. You can go to democracynow.org to see the chief's conversation yesterday as he attempted to get in to the Climate Action Summit. Meanwhile, President Trump used his UN General Assembly address to denounce Iran and to call on nations to reject globalism and embrace nationalism.
Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots.
In other news from the United Nations, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan called on world leaders Tuesday to address the crisis in Kashmir, warning India's illegal annexation of the occupied territory could lead to a war between the two nuclear-armed states.
This is unprecedented. 8 million people in an open jail is unprecedented in this day and age. And then this nonsense that this is a part of India, so the world should stay out. Just to remind the world that there are 11 Security Council, UN Security Council resolutions that recognize Kashmir as a disputed territory.
Meanwhile, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake hit Pakistan-administered Kashmir Tuesday. At least 25 people died. More than 300 have been injured. The British Parliament reconvened today after the Supreme Court issued a historic ruling declaring Prime Minister Boris Johnson had illegally suspended Parliament in order to push through Brexit with or without a deal. Johnson made the unprecedented move late last month, asking the Queen to prorogue Parliament in order to limit debate on leaving the European Union, which the UK is scheduled to do by October 31st. On Tuesday, opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn called on Johnson to resign.
Boris Johnson has been found to have misled the country. This unelected Prime Minister should now resign.
Later in the broadcast, we will speak with the British singer-songwriter and political activist Billy Bragg. Egyptian authorities have arrested as many as 900 people, including journalists and human rights lawyers, in a widening crackdown following anti-government protests. The arrests come as Egyptian ruler Abdel Fattah el-Sisi is in New York for the UN General Assembly. On Monday, President Trump met with el-Sisi and praised him as a, quote, great leader. Trump recently described el-Sisi as his, quote, favorite dictator. The Spanish Supreme Court has ruled in favor of exhuming the remains of former dictator Francisco Franco, who was buried in a state mausoleum in 1975. The ruling was a victory for victims of Franco's regime, who have long argued he should not be recognized in any public site. Pablo Mayoral, who was imprisoned for 2 years during Franco's regime, welcomed the court's decision.
A fascist Nazi dictator like Franco can't be publicly recognized in the Valley of the Fallen or in the Almudena Cathedral or in any public site. The remains should be given to the family to be kept in the family site.
In news from Africa, a Nigerian court granted bail Tuesday to the journalist and activist Omoyele Sowore, but he remains in state custody. He's been jailed since August 3rd, shortly after he called for peaceful nationwide protests against the government. Sowore has been charged with treason and other offenses. He's a former presidential candidate and the founder of the New York-based news outlet Sahara Reporters. He's also a past guest on Democracy Now! In business news, German prosecutors have indicted 3 top executives at Volkswagen, including the company's CEO, for market manipulation. The executives are accused of not informing investors soon enough about the company's diesel emissions scandal. The indictments come 4 years after the automaker admitted to installing devices on millions of cars to circumvent emissions tests. In presidential campaign news, Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a new wealth tax on billionaires, saying it's needed to tackle what he called the outrageous and grotesque and immoral levels of inequality in the United States. On Tuesday, Sanders tweeted, quote, "There should be no billionaires. We're going to tax their extreme wealth and invest in working people." Sanders estimates the tax would raise over $4 trillion in revenue over 10 years. Workers at General Motors have entered their 10th day on strike. It's now the longest national strike the United Auto Workers has had at GM in nearly 50 years. A U.S. judge has sided with the Trump administration and thrown out a lawsuit filed by an American journalist who believes he was placed on the U.S. kill list. The journalist, Bilal Abdul Karim, filed the lawsuit after claiming he was nearly killed in 5 U.S. drone and missile strikes in Syria. The judge allowed the Trump administration to invoke its state secrets privilege to block the release of information about its kill list. Abdul Karim's attorney, Tara Plochaki, said, quote, "For the first time ever, a United States federal court ruled that the government may kill one of its citizens without providing him the information necessary to prove that he's being wrongly targeted and does not deserve to die." In health news, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker has declared a public health emergency and ordered a 4-month ban on vaping products. Meanwhile, the CEO of the embattled e-cigarette company Juul, Kevin Burns, has just announced he's stepping down. And the winners of this year's Right Livelihood Awards have just been announced. The prize is widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. The head of the Right Livelihood Foundation, Ole van Wuxkel, announced the laureates earlier today in Stockholm, Sweden.
Greta Thunberg receives the Right Livelihood Award for inspiring and amplifying political demands for urgent climate action reflecting scientific facts. Aminatou Haidar receives the 2019 Right Livelihood Award for her steadfast, non-violent action despite torture and imprisonment in pursuit of justice and self-determination for the people of Western Sahara. Guo Jianmei receives the Right Livelihood Award for her pioneering and persistent work in securing women's rights in China. Davi Kopenawa and the Yanomami Hutukara Association receive the Right Livelihood Award for their courageous determination to protect the forests and biodiversity of the Amazon and the lands and culture of its indigenous peoples.
Visit democracynow.org to see our interviews with Greta Thunberg and Aminatou Haidar. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners across the country and around the world. The House of Representatives is launching a formal impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump, who becomes just the fourth U.S. president to face a possible impeachment. On Tuesday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi accused Trump of betraying his oath of office, the country's national security, and the integrity of our election system.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
For months, Speaker Pelosi had resisted calls by progressive Democrats to back impeachment, but that changed after President Trump publicly admitted he urged the president of Ukraine to open a probe into the dealings of his potential 2020 rival, Joe Biden, and his son, Hunter, who served on the board of one of Ukraine's largest natural gas companies. Trump has also admitted to withholding $391 million in aid to Ukraine. After Pelosi made the announcement, Trump fired back on Twitter, calling the inquiry, quote, witch hunt garbage. He spoke to reporters at the UN earlier Tuesday and said efforts to impeach him would hurt the Democrats.
They're going to lose the election, and they figured this is a thing to do. It was a perfect call. There was no quid pro quo, unlike Biden. There was no nothing. It was a perfect call, a very nice call. And in fact, I thought this was very nice. Ukraine just came out and made a very good statement. It was a very good call. There was no pressure put on them whatsoever.
The Ukraine scandal came to light after a whistleblower in the intelligence community wrote an internal complaint about Trump's actions. On Tuesday, the Republican-controlled Senate unanimously passed a non-binding resolution calling on the Trump administration to release the whistleblower's complaint. Meanwhile, the actions of Trump's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, in Ukraine are facing new scrutiny. The Washington Post reports he pursued a shadow agenda on Ukraine, pushing aside key foreign policy officials. Giuliani says he did it at the behest of the State Department. Impeachment is the formal charging of wrongdoing against a president, and Trump would be just the third president to face impeachment. Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton were both impeached, while Richard Nixon faced an impeachment vote amidst the Watergate scandal. He resigned before the impeachment articles against him were filed. For more, we turn to two guests. Joining us from the Cannon Rotunda on Capitol Hill, Congressmember Al Green, Democrat from Texas. In 2017, he became the first Congressmember to call for President Trump's impeachment from the floor of the House of Representatives. And in Madison, Wisconsin, John Nichols, political writer for The Nation, is joining us. His recent article, Pelosi Announces Impeachment Inquiry, Now Congress Has to Get It Right. He's the author of a number of books, including Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America, and The Genius of Impeachment, the founder's cure for royalism. He's working on a book on the future of the Democratic Party. We welcome you both back to Democracy Now! Congressmember Green, let's begin with you. Well, you were the first to call for impeachment from the floor of the House. Explain your response to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's announcement yesterday. You've been pushing for this for quite some time.
Thank you for having me on. And just as a sidebar, thank you for the news that you deliver. I find your news to be so thorough and so fact-based. I must say I compliment you. With reference to the impeachment effort, I believe that yesterday was a vindication for a good many people. This movement did not start with me per se. I did go to the floor, but the people have made this a moment that has to be recognized. In fact, it's a seminal moment in time that can impact the rest of our time. So I'm just grateful that we have now nearly 200 persons who are on board. We need 218 people to impeach, and I think we've reached critical mass. Yesterday was evidence of what happened prior to yesterday. We have been building on this. We initially brought articles before the Congress and received 58 votes, thereafter 66, and on the third attempt, 95. So this is something that's been building, but it wouldn't happen but for the people that we meet in train stations, in airports, in food markets, who are constantly asking, what are we going to do? I think yesterday was a response to all of the many people who have continued to press the issue.
Well, Congressman Green, could you lay out for our viewers and listeners what you believe are the main impeachable offenses that President Trump has committed?
There are many. Obviously, what has just happened recently with Ukraine, the president calling the president of Ukraine, and in an effort to get him to take a position on Mr. Biden, President Biden, Vice President Biden, if you will, in terms of what his son may have done, in an effort to use this apparently, I say apparently, in the upcoming election, and withholding tax dollars in an effort to get this done, apparently. This is impeachable. I would also mention the emoluments clause, and articles have been filed with reference to the president benefiting from persons who are staying in his hotels, and that's much to be said about that. I would also never forget the racism, the bigotry, the xenophobia, the homophobia, the Islamophobia, the fact that the president has infused his bigotry into policy. So we have the obstruction cases, and I did call for obstruction as an article of impeachment. I have indicated that we need to deal with the racism and the bigotry as well. So there are many articles that can be brought.
Congressmember Al Green, I want to turn to a video that President Trump tweeted Tuesday after Pelosi's announcement. The video shows a number of Democratic Congress members and senators calling for his impeachment. It features your remarks followed by Trump's response.
If we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected.
It's time to stop this nonsense. They think they're going to win. Did you see the one man? He said it's the only way we're going to beat him in 2020. They have to do this. The only way well, that's a compliment, I guess. But think of what he said. It's the only way they're going to beat me. And actually, it's working the other way.
So that video was retweeted by Trump, and it was that was retweeted by Trump, but it was only a selection, a small part of the video. But let me get your response. And also, what about those who are saying right now, the American people want you to focus on the issues, health care, education, jobs, rather than impeachment. First, the Democrats waited for the Mueller report, and it turns out that what President Trump was being accused of, obstruction of justice, what he was being accused of in regards to colluding with the Russians was not true. And now they'll pursue this to the election. What Trump is saying and a number of others are saying is this will surely mean your demise. Your response, Congressman Green?
Multiple responses. The first is that the president took my words out of context. I never said that this is the only way we would defeat him. What I indicated was that if we did not honor our duty and responsibility to the Constitution and impeach the president, that he could claim vindication by our inaction. And as a result, he would use that to campaign and could seek and be reelected because he would use the fact that we didn't impeach him and say that he was vindicated. Next point, to those who would contend that this is not a kitchen table issue, I would differ, especially as it relates to the bigotry infused into policy. African Americans at the kitchen table talk about how they didn't get a promotion because of discrimination, how they were not hired because of discrimination. Discrimination is a kitchen table issue for people who are being discriminated against. LGBTQ persons who go to work knowing that if they announce that they have married the love of their life and that person happens to be of the same sex, knowing that they can be fired. For them, that's a kitchen table issue. So we should not assume that all kitchen table issues are the same. There are additional kitchen table issues that people who are discriminated against are having to deal with. And finally, I would make this point. We have a responsibility to the country and to the future. The future is going to be one that will allow a president to assume that there are no guardrails if we don't act now. We have to demonstrate that Congress will honor the Constitution and that we have principle that we will place above politics, that we will place the people above our political parties. And I think that if we do this, we will consider democracy and not Democrats. We will consider the Republic and not Republicans. I just have to add this as well. This journey is not one that we choose to embark upon. It's one that we have to. And when those members came out who were in those what I would call high-risk districts and put principle above party, they were a part of what is being called the straw. I called it a moment of truth. I called it a point of no return, because we have reached a point now where we must go forward with impeachment. If we do not, we will have shredded the Constitution and betrayed our trust as members of Congress.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in John Nichols, political writer for The Nation. John, I wanted to ask you this latest situation with the president's discussion, phone conversation with the president of Ukraine has apparently become a turning point for Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats on the issue of whether to begin an impeachment inquiry. What's your assessment of this? After all, there are those who say that American presidents are constantly in phone conversations threatening leaders of other countries if they don't do what the U.S. wants, and also of Trump's rebuttal about the whole issue of Hunter Biden having been so heavily involved in the Ukraine at the time that Joe Biden was vice president and also attempted to influence the Ukrainian government.
It's a very good question, Juan. Thanks for asking it, and also I'm honored to be on with Congressman Green. At the heart of your question is the answer, of course. Presidents are often on the phone yelling at other leaders, trying to get what America wants, what the United States wants. That's not what is at stake here. What is at stake here is the question of whether Donald Trump got on a phone trying to get what he wanted. And the genius of the American Constitution, which, is, I think even the founders would tell you, wasn't perfect. But one of the geniuses of it is this system of checks and balances, and also the clear definition of the role of people in these positions. And one of the things we understand, and Congressman Green referenced the Emoluments Clause, is that you don't take the presidency in order to advance your own personal interests, be they economic or, once you are in the office, political. You cannot use the office to undermine or harm your political rivals. And so in this case, if the president of the United States, as he suggests, was on a phone call with the newly elected leader of a country that is really, kind of one of the epicenters of global conflict and struggle, if he was on the phone with this leader and he said, hey, I'd really like you to do this investigation of this son of a political rival. Now, acknowledging whatever Hunter Biden may have done and all the concerns about the past, if the president of the United States did that, and if it can be reasonably understood that he did that for political purposes, as he is clearly confirming, I believe, in his statements about this, saying continually going after Biden, who still is the frontrunner in most polls to become his Democratic opponent in 2020, then he has abused his office in the most classic sense. And we have, again, something that is sort of part and parcel of impeachment. This is why you have the impeachment power. It exists so that presidents of the United States do not assume the position of the presidency and then use it and use the power of the United States government, because when he makes that call, he is speaking for the United States government, to advance their own political position. If they do that, they can be impeached, And in fact, as Congressman Green says, if you don't impeach in such a circumstance, you virtually assure that this becomes the new normal. And it should not be considered normal for a president to try and use foreign powers to undermine his political rivals.
I'd like to turn to Democratic Congressmember John Lewis, the civil rights icon, addressing the House on Tuesday.
We must not wait. Now is the time to act. I have been patient while we tried every other path and used every other tool. We will never find the truth unless we use the power given to the House of Representatives and the House alone to begin an official investigation as dictated by the Constitution. The future of our democracy is at stake. There comes a time when you have to be moved by the spirit of history to take action to protect and preserve the integrity of our nation. I truly believe, the time to begin impeachment proceedings against this president has come. To delay or to do otherwise would betray the foundation of our democracy.
That's Georgia Congressmember John Lewis on the floor of the House on Tuesday. Congressmember Green, can you lay out what happens next? House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that 6 House committees will be leading this inquiry. Of course, many might say they could be doing other things, like leading the country forward in other ways. But explain exactly how it happens. You'll have the intelligence chief coming forward. You have President Trump saying he's releasing the transcript of his phone call with the new president of Ukraine. Explain what the chronology will be from here on in.
Thank you. Let me first compliment John on his commentary and add one thing, and that is that the president doesn't have to commit a crime to be impeached. I think this is very important because many times people will want to see evidence of what we might have to present in court. And impeachment in the House of Representatives does not have the standards that you might have in court. There is no need for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, clear and convincing evidence. There will be no appeal of this. It will be an opportunity for members to weigh in with a vote. And they will cast their votes without announcing why. My hope is that all will do so because their consciences have led them to do the appropriate thing. With reference to how we will proceed, the various committees can all submit their evidence, if you will, of impeachable offenses. And once this is done, there are no real rules that say that the articles have to be drafted by the Judiciary Committee. The articles can be drafted, and that can happen with a select committee. It can happen with the Judiciary Committee. It can happen with a single person. We have proven that this can occur because we have filed 3 times, and each time they were approved by the presiding officer. So all of the articles presented before were in order. Once they are presented to the House, we will then vote. Assuming there are 435 members present, it will take 218 to have a majority such that we will then send the articles to the Senate, a majority voting to impeach, I might add. Once the articles get to the Senate, we then have a trial in the Senate. Now, here's the question that Chief Justice John Roberts has to address. Will he allow the majority leader of the Senate to cause him to preside over a kangaroo court? Will the Honorable John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States of America, allow the majority leader of the Senate to simply walk in and say, enough of this, let's vote to dismiss and move on? I would want to believe that his integrity, his honor, his standing in history, his legacy would lead him to believe that there has to be some evidence of a trial such that people will conclude he did not allow this to become a runaway kangaroo court that embarrassed not only the Senate, but also the Supreme Court. With reference to what you were asking me about the evidence that may be presented, all of this is to be considered. There is no standard for the evidence that is needed. Once the House concludes that the president has committed an impeachable offense because of his misconduct, misdemeanors are misconduct, offenses that involve misconduct. They may be criminal, but they need not be. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868 in Article 10 of misdemeanors. They were called high misdemeanors. John has written about this quite eloquently and accurately, I might add. And with the ability to impeach for high misdemeanors, no crime necessary, no requirement that you have rules of evidence, the House can draft its articles of impeachment based upon the president's confessions. The president has a way of not only performing what I will call ugly deeds, some would say dastardly deeds, performing these deeds, and then he confesses. He has indicated that he talked to the president. He has indicated that the conversation was about Biden, and we know that he was withholding funds. He did this right after Mr. Mueller gave his testimony on the Hill. He is testing us. He continually tests to see how far we will allow him to go. Just as a 3-year-old would test, and we have to at some point stand up to him and let him know that the line has been drawn and you will go no further.
Thank you so much for being with us. Houston Congressmember Al Green, Texas Democrat, and John Nichols, political writer for The Nation, has written a book about impeachment. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, President Trump calls for intensifying tension with Iran. We'll speak with Vijay Prashad. Then the British rocker, the British singer-songwriter Billy Bragg on Brexit and what's happening in the British Parliament as we broadcast. Stay with us.
If my words did glow with the gold of sunshine, and my tunes were played on the harp unstrung, would you hear my voice come through the music? Would you hold it near as it were your own? It's a hand-me-down. The thoughts are broken. Perhaps they're better left unsung. I don't know.
Ripple by the Grateful Dead. The band's longtime lyricist, Robert Hunter, died on Tuesday. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, on Tuesday, President Trump made his third address to the United Nations General Assembly amid simmering tensions in the Middle East over recent attacks on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, which the United States blames on Iran. Tehran denies the allegations. This is Trump addressing the General Assembly.
All nations have a duty to act. No responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted. They will be tightened.
President Trump also lashed out at China and Venezuela. For more, we go to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we're joined by Vijay Prashad, whose article on Salon is headlined, "World Leaders Gather at the UN in the Face of War, Climate Catastrophe, and Global Worker Exploitation." Vijay Prashad is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and chief editor of Leftward Books, also chief correspondent of Globetrotter and author of The Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South. We thank you so much for being with us, Vijay. Can you respond to what now seems like ancient history, which was actually just yesterday morning, President Trump addressing the UN General Assembly right before, a few hours before, it was announced that the House would begin formal impeachment proceedings against him. But talk about his message.
You're quite right, Amy. It does appear like ancient history, but it's a very, it was a very chilling speech. Trump attempted to suggest that he was a nationalist, pushing the agenda of so-called patriotism against globalism. That's how Trump tried to define his own politics. Of course, this is quite incoherent. On the one side, Mr. Trump and people like him use the term patriotism or sovereignty to defend their right not to participate in international treaties, such as treaties about climate change, about refugees, and about the Iran nuclear deal. You had Bolsonaro give a very spirited defense of so-called Brazilian sovereignty to allow the Amazon to be exploited. So you had Mr. Trump, for instance, here use this language of sovereignty to remove the United States from its international obligations. On the other side, quite in contradistinction to this, Mr. Trump put forward what can only be described as an imperialist agenda. In other words, there was no consideration for the sovereignty of Iran or Venezuela. In fact, he used language which I was quite shocked by, the term bloodlust, for instance, to describe Iranian foreign policy. So, it wasn't quite patriotism on one side or sovereignty on one side and globalism. It wasn't a principal distinction. In fact, behind the cover of sovereignty, Mr. Trump was saying countries like the United States and Brazil don't have to conform to the climate treaties that have been agreed upon on the international stage. We just had this very powerful climate strike initiated by Greta Thunberg. I think this kind of thing, this kind of attitude about sovereignty was a way of setting that aside. But on the other hand, as I said, incoherently, he lashed out at Iran. And, you've got to understand that the countries of the world are not interested in a war against Iran. And the same day, Mr. Macron, the president of France, met with Iran's President Rouhani, and they talked about revisiting the diplomatic, table, coming back and opening a discussion about diplomacy. This is something the United States completely abhors, doesn't want diplomacy with Iran, doesn't want diplomacy with Venezuela. I thought it was a very dangerous speech, and you're quite correct. It has been, in a sense, overwhelmed by this discussion about impeachment.
And Vijay Prashad, he also, as you mentioned, talked about Venezuela, blasting the Venezuelan leadership, President Maduro, and at one point saying that socialism, as he said, not capitalism, only benefits the ruling class. Could you talk about his continued fixation on Venezuela?
Yeah, this is very interesting, and it also has something to do with the American domestic political landscape, because Mr. Trump, had pushed his economic advisors to release earlier this year a document attacking socialism. One hasn't seen this from an American president in a very long time. It's part of his election strategy to portray the Democratic Party as a party of socialists, and being therefore out of touch with what he considers to be reality. And I think he's trying very much to utilize the Venezuela crisis to link it to people like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and perhaps even Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. This fixation with Venezuela is very interesting. The attempt to overthrow the government in Venezuela has failed. That, I think, has to be said quite clearly. But Mr. Trump continues to push against Venezuela. He's a little bit like the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia on Yemen, unable to understand that their policy has failed. It's increasing suffering both in countries like Yemen and in Venezuela. He's unable to understand that the policy has failed and they need to pivot outwards. They're not doing that. And I think that this is something that the American people need to really consider. There is a hallucination in the Trump administration regarding the fight against Venezuela and Iran. If the United States moves to a much more aggressive kind of sanctions regime, moves even to aerial bombardment, I'm afraid at a time when we need to have more international conversations, more diplomacy, more discussions about things like the climate strike, about things like the refugee crisis, about things like the hunger epidemic. When this should be at the table, the United States instead is pushing what I think are very divisive and dangerous policies with Iran and Venezuela at the center. There is no defense of sovereignty or nationalism when it comes to these countries. Here, in a sense, the United States has withdrawn Iranian and Venezuelan sovereignty and is basically is now sort of going to the world's countries who are not interested in war and saying, please join us. It shows, in a sense, the isolation of the U.S. policy on both Iran and Venezuela.
I wanted to play the Saudi Foreign Minister, Adel al-Jubeir, blaming Iran for the attacks on oil refineries in Saudi Arabia earlier this month.
We believe that Iran is responsible for the attack because the equipment is Iranian equipment. We know that it didn't come from the south. We know it because of the range of the equipment. We believe it came from the north. We're certain it came from the north. And what we're doing now is investigating to locate the actual launch site. We will await the results of the investigation, which I expect to be fairly soon. And then we will decide on what steps to take in dealing with Iran. It has to be made clear to Iran that such behavior is not acceptable and that there will be consequences for such behavior.
So that's the Saudi foreign minister. Vijay Prashad, at the beginning of this, I said, yesterday's speech by President Trump was ancient history. And then they had the announcement of the impeachment proceedings by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. But, in fact, could this push for impeachment actually accelerate some kind of attack in the Middle East that the U.S. could be involved with? How often war is used as a kind of distraction from a terrible problem at home, and how you think that could be avoided? Do you think that's possible? And President Trump saying that they are waiting for direction from Saudi Arabia deciding what to do, and then announcing the U.S. is sending troops to Saudi Arabia to protect their oil fields.
Amy, I'm very glad you raised this issue. You may remember when there was talk of impeachment of Bill Clinton, there was a sudden airstrike, missile strike against a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan. There was also a strike in Afghanistan at that time. It was when the film Wag the Dog came out, a suggestion that war is used to distract from these kind of domestic political entanglements. I think I'm very worried about this. I think it's a very plausible thing. It's quite disgraceful that the United States government has said that they want to take the lead from Saudi Arabia. I'm glad the Saudi foreign minister has said that he'd like to wait for the results of the investigation. Although I must say I'm not very confident that the Saudi investigation is going to be credible. I think that there should be a call at the United Nations for an international investigation. We need to have credible people going there and looking at the debris, looking at the missiles and so on. At this point, I think it's important to mention that it's not only Foreign Minister Javad Zarif of Iran who said that Iran didn't do this strike, but the Iranian military has also said that they did not do this strike. And at the same time, the Yemeni Houthis said that they did do the strike. Sometimes one should listen to people and see what they're saying. But more than that, I think there should be a call for an international investigation of the debris. It should not be left to the Saudis. Their credibility is extraordinarily low. And if the Saudis, with a very incredulous investigation, say that Iran did this, if the United States government then takes that Saudi conclusion to go to war against Iran as a way to distract from the impeachment inquiry, I must say this is a very dangerous moment for world history, and I very much hope people will call for an international investigation rather than allow the Saudis to be leading this.
Vijay Prashad, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Chief Editor at Leftward Books, also the Chief Correspondent of Globetrotter. We'll link to your recent article in Salon headlined, World Leaders Gather at the UN in the Face of War, Climate Catastrophe and Global worker exploitation. Vijay Prashad will be speaking at the Lensic Performing Arts Center tonight in Santa Fe at 7 o'clock. When we come back, we speak with legendary British singer-songwriter and activist Billy Bragg about the British Supreme Court's stunning ruling that Prime Minister Johnson had illegally suspended Parliament. What does this mean for Brexit? Stay with us.
I ain't got no home, I'm just a roaming round, just a wandering worker. I go from town to town, and the police make it hard for me no matter where I go. And I ain't got no home in this world anymore. No, I ain't got no home in this world anymore. My brothers and my sisters are stranded on this road, long and dusty road that 1,000,000 feet of trod. Now the rich man took my home.
Billy Bragg singing Woody Guthrie's song, I Ain't Got No Home, here in our Democracy Now! Studio in 2011. He joins us again in 2019. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is Democracy Now!
Well, we go now to the United Kingdom, where Parliament has reconvened in an uproar after the Supreme Court ruled Tuesday that Prime Minister Boris Johnson had unlawfully suspended Parliament in order to push through Brexit with or without a deal. Johnson made the unprecedented move late last month, asking the Queen to prorogue or suspend Parliament in order to limit debate on leaving the European Union, which the UK is scheduled to do by October 31st. But Tuesday, Supreme Court head Lady Brenda Hale announced the court had unanimously ruled against Johnson and Parliament had not been prorogued.
The court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. Parliament has not been prorogued.
Prorogued or suspended, she says. Calls for Johnson's resignation are mounting since the news broke on Tuesday. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn has called for a general election and demanded Johnson apologize to the Queen and to the country. The House of Commons is currently in the midst of a raucous session as we broadcast. Prime Minister Johnson's expected to address Parliament this afternoon. This is Johnson responding to the Supreme Court's decision in New York on Tuesday, where he'd been attending the United Nations General Assembly.
Let's be absolutely clear. We respect the judiciary in our country. We respect the court. I disagree profoundly with what they had to say. Frankly, I think we need to get on with Brexit. That's the overwhelming view of the British people. Whether they voted to leave or remain, they want to get this thing done by October the 31st. And that's what we're going to do.
For more, we're joined by the legendary British singer-songwriter, activist Billy Bragg. His book, The 3 Dimensions of Freedom, has just been published. Billy, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Glad to be here, Amy.
So we're learning a new word in the United States.
Yes.
Prorogue.
Prorogue, yeah. Suspend. I mean, normally this time of year, there is a suspension of Parliament because the three main parties have their party conventions in consecutive weeks. This week was the Labour Party, last week the Liberal Democrats, next week the Conservatives. So there normally is a break-up of Parliament here. What Boris did was introduce the idea of a new Queen's speech, which is when the government put forward a new programme, and they generally suspend Parliament for a couple of weeks to get that ready. When you add that to the time suspended for the party conventions, with the deadline for leaving the European Union coming at the end of October, all of a sudden it looked as if, well, it's been proved right now that he's unlawfully suspended Parliament in order to avoid accountability over his lack of a deal for the European Union.
And, of course, all of this is continue the controversy over Brexit and what to do about Brexit. You've said that Brexit is an English phenomenon and an English nationalist phenomenon. Can you talk about that?
Sure. It's the vote for it is really concentrated in England. Scotland voted a majority against. Northern Ireland voted a majority against. Wales voted in favour, but in those areas where there are predominantly English incomers. So the English don't have clear representation in our national devolved parliaments. The Scots have a parliament, the Welsh have an assembly, the Northern Irish do, but the English don't. And slowly but surely they're trying to manifest that sensibility. And it's really what's behind Brexit is ordinary working people feeling they no longer have agency over their lives. They feel that the economy is no longer responding to them, that politics doesn't work for them. In many ways similar to the people, I think, who voted for Trump in the United States of America. And this lack of agency, this feeling that they can no longer have control over their lives, is magnified by the European Union, they feel, because they are distant, they're in Brussels. And although we all get to vote in the elections, we don't have that close connection with them. So the European Union have become a focus for anger that really should be directed at the Westminster government that Boris Johnson leads.
So you've compared a no-deal Brexit to Trump's border wall. Why?
I think Brexit period and the border wall are both really chimera. It doesn't matter if they happen or not. It's what they offer Trump and what they offer the Conservatives in my country. As long as there's a plan to leave the European Union or a plan to build the wall, this will act as a clear signal to every bigot, every racist, every misogynist in the United States of America and the UK that their ideas are legitimised by this notion of keeping people out, this notion of closing in on ourselves. I don't think that Brexit will happen. I think that the cost of it in terms of peace in Northern Ireland and our long-term relationship with the other 27 nations in Europe is too high a cost for legislators to actually pass it. We've already seen, because there was an opportunity at the end of March for us to have left the European Union, but the hard-line Brexiteers who want a harder-line Brexit didn't support their own government. So, on one hand, there's those of us who want to remain in the European Union. We believe the cost is too high. But the hard-line Brexiteers who would have had to deal with a compromise over the relationship with Europe, there would have still been some involvement with the European Court, there would have still been some trade agreements. That was too high a price for them. So I think for both sides...
Like the grandson of Winston Churchill.
Yeah, the grandson of Winston... Well, no, not him, because he's more of a middle way man. I'm talking about what we call they refer to the European Research Group, and these are the people who want to leave with absolutely no deal. They're quite extreme, and the problem is, broadly, the debate has become extreme on both sides. There's other people who want to leave with no deal, or people who want to just abandon the whole thing. Where actually, what's going to keep us in the European Union, I believe, is nuance. It's the nuance of the Irish border, it's the nuance of the Good Friday Peace Accord, it's the nuance of our trade with the European Union. But nobody seems interested in nuance. Jeremy Corbyn is trying to put forward a policy at the next election where he lets the people decide, where he says, look, if you elect me, I will go to Brussels, get a better deal, I will put it to a referendum, the opportunity to remain will be on the referendum, but you ultimately will decide. The Liberal Democrats are saying we're just going to abandon the whole thing and walk away. The Tories are saying we're just going to get no deal, which really nobody voted for that. That's a disastrous outcome. So Corbyn, strangely, has become the moderate, which actually has become a bit of a pejorative term in my country recently.
I want to ask you about your book, The Three Dimensions of Freedom. If you could talk about the title itself.
Sure. Well, basically it argues that free speech alone is not enough to guarantee a free society. It's true that we all have the right to express our opinion, but unless that is matched with a commitment to equality, the right to respect other people's opinions, but more importantly, some amount of accountability. I think without equality, free speech is nothing more than privilege. But without accountability, free speech is the most dangerous freedom of all, and that's impunity. And I think we've seen both in Donald Trump and in Boris Johnson leaders who are seeking to act with impunity. The last leader in my country that acted in the way Boris Johnson has done was Charles I, and we chopped his head off.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Billy Bragg. This is part one of our conversation. We're going to do part two, and we're going to post it online at democracynow.org, and also maybe get a little live singing in. Billy Bragg, the legendary British singer-songwriter, he has a new book out. It's called The Three Dimensions of Freedom. It's just been published. We'll be doing a public conversation tonight at 7:30 at the Brooklyn Public Library. Come on, come one, come all. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Massoud, Sharina Nadura, Temuרי Astudio, and Maria Taracena. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera are engineers. To see all of our coverage of the UN Climate Action Summit and the movements inside and outside, go to democracynow.org. You can also visit our video and audio podcasts and read all our transcripts. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez for another edition of Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Thanks so much for joining us.